It's a committee which is supposed to look for solutions to rebalance trade once again.
It's being used to justify these policies, which have been developing since 2022.
For Germany, if you are going to rebalance the trade with another country, the best way is trying to promote export instead of to limit export.
It's not simply that Germany is now sticking very faithfully to the principle of the free market.
We respect the relation with Germany, but everyone have to look at the fact and find out a better way to adapt it to the new situation.
I think both sides should make a serious constructive effort to try to arrive at some compromise solution.
The Chat Lounge. Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tuyin. Berlin is reportedly setting up a committee to re-examine what it calls security-related trade policies towards Beijing. Joining me for a chat on this topic, Professor Klaus Larres, the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the United States. Professor Josef Mahoney, a professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University, and Dr. Zhou Mi, the deputy director of the Institute of American and Oceania Study, Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. So, Professor Larres, it's your first time on this show. Shall we begin with you?
Absolutely, if you like.
Thank you. Given the fact that China has just overtaken the U.S. to become Germany's #1 trading partner, how surprised are you by the German government's move?
Well, I wasn't really that surprised because there has been a lot of trade tension between Germany and China for quite some time. The new chancellor said when he came to office, and even before he came to office, that he wanted to re-evaluate connections and trade relations with China. And I think that is what he has done now. As you know, Germany at the moment is in deep economic trouble. It is put under pressure by both the United States because of Trump's tariffs largely, and also by China because of various practices by China which the German government has criticized. They feel that the Chinese are trading with Germany in an increasingly unfair way. That is, of course, rejected by China, but the German government sees it like that, and they therefore wish to rectify the situation by investigating the entire economic and trade relationship with China, and they will make use of academics, they will make use of experts and politicians to set up a committee to investigate the relationship. And I think we can go into what the German government is criticizing in a little while.
Sure. Then to Professor Mahoney, any specific incident you think of that might trigger this move? Some analysts are pointing to China's tighter control over rare earth exports and the next semiconductor case as triggers. What's your take?
I think it's sort of a complicated narrative. On the one hand, we do know that there's been a strategic shift in Germany going back to February 2022, when the German government began some new policies aimed at reducing strategic dependencies and trying to move into a more assertive foreign policy. Now, not only in terms of building up its military capacity, but also taking a more proactive role in defending what it sees as its economic interest. Partly, I would say the one thing that my colleague neglected to say is they are feeling pressure from the United States. They are claiming to feel pressure from China. And they are also, of course, pointing the finger at Russia and the conflict in Ukraine for bringing not only economic pain to Germany, but also new security concerns that have to be financed and paid for. Those are some of the things. But to get to what triggered it, I think certainly the export controls that we saw China finally moving into place recently, which I would argue was, and I think the Chinese government intended it primarily as a strategic move vis-a-vis the trade war with the United States, although it has been building that mechanism for a longer period of time. And even though from what I hear from Berlin is that the Chinese government assured European countries that they weren't going to be targeted specifically by these measures. I do think from some of the academics that I speak to in Germany that there was some grave concern that the rollout of that policy by China would be used to justify and accelerate these kinds of policies, which again, there has been a strategic move since 2022, but, it's been moving slowly, step by step, even to the point where a lot of people weren't even certain that there was a real plan to go this far. But now that we've reached this point, people are pointing, I think, to the export controls as one justification, but it goes beyond that. I think, there have been accusations from the German government of forced technology transfers. There have been allegations of industrial espionage, allegations of unfair competition and market distortion. And then on top of that, you have the critical dependencies, raw materials like the rare earths. But I think there's one more thing that we have to really point out here, which is Germany is now in the moment of accelerating its investment in what they call dual purpose approach to rebuilding and advancing its military capabilities. And the goal there is to create or services that can serve national defense, but can also serve the broader economic well-being. So as they're starting to pour billions into that project, they want to make sure that those new developments are not going outward to other countries that they might consider to be a strategic rival.
And Dr. Zhou, hearing what these two professors just said, do you think Germany actually has a legitimate reason to take this kind of step?
Well, in my understanding that all the countries have the rights to protect its national security.
All right.
And I don't think that exports control is a kind of, very abnormal practices taken by the different countries. And Germany already, before this step, they already put, some items in the export control system. So I think that is a kind of maybe, reactions according to the uncertainty of the world. And in my understanding, each government has its own attitudes and principles. For most of these businesses, we should try to do more to consider about the market rules. But I can understand that sometimes maybe there will be some overreact on certain kind of practices. I guess maybe there are some problems also about the disruptions in certain supply chains, including, the semiconductors of the Chinese companies and also the Dutch companies, the corporation have some impact on Germany's supply chains of automobiles also. So in this regard, I think that we should sit down and discuss about the real reason and what can we do to improve the mutual trust and also trying to find out a way instead of just to say that I have a tool, I will try to control something and trying to stop the market, because we are saying that especially for China and Germany, we are the large manufacturing countries. We have so many vertical corporations in the supply chains, in the automobile industries, in electronics, in many other areas. So the collaborations are helping both of us to benefit from this better development in the past decades. We cannot just say that everything will return to be normal. So let's guess if the German government has put some restrictions on the cooperation between our two countries, what would be the response from these enterprises? And should they just try partners or trying to make it even more expensive to cooperate with other partners? I don't think that is a good choice.
Indeed, it's like a double-edged sword. It's not like it wouldn't hurt Germany to an extent. Actually, like we mentioned, China has just become Germany's number one trade partner. And besides, the harm on the German side is not inflicted by China, right? We know from January to August, Germany's exports to the U.S. totaled a little over 100 billion euros. That's down 6.5%, mainly due to Washington's tariff hikes, protectionist measures. So Germany itself has been a victim of protectionism. Professor Larres, why would Berlin now turn to similar measures? Doesn't Berlin have any concern that this approach could backfire, given, China could respond with some retaliatory moves like hinted by Dr. Zhou here?
Yeah, In principle, Germany is for free trade. And the Chancellor, I think, in his speech last week has emphasized that again. But he also said that times have changed and that Germany needs to protect itself, that Europe needs to protect itself from onslaughts from other countries. And he was referring to the United States and Trump's tariff war, but he was also referring above all to China. And it is, I think, recognized in German circles that China is much less reliable than it used to be. And that has started with the mass diplomacy during the pandemic, when it suddenly evolved that Germany could not rely on the fact that it could safely obtain masks from China, because China decided to send them somewhere else rather than to Germany and to Europe, for example. And that has now continued, for example, what was mentioned with the rare earths and export licenses. If you have a partner like China who suddenly restricts export licenses, suddenly restricts rare earth minerals, and that damages your own industry, particularly important industries like the car industry, like military production and other industries, then you wonder whether you really can continue your policy of the past, whether you do not have to also protect yourself and assume other policies. And I think that is what the German government is trying to do. As I said at the beginning, the German economy is not doing very well at all. There are severe industrial crises, not least in the car industry, but there's also in many other manufacturing industries. And so the Germans feel they have to protect themselves. Otherwise, for example, China will exploit the situation. And they criticize what was partially mentioned, the overcapacity of Chinese products. EV vehicles comes to mind, of course, but also solar panels. They criticize the subsidy culture in China. They also, of course, geopolitically very much resent that China is very close to Russia. And all that means that the Germans feel they cannot rely on China as much as in the past. China has actually evolved from being a partner to Germany to being a rival and competitor. And I don't think that Merz and the German government actually likes that situation, but they feel they need to defend themselves and have to protect themselves.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
But like Chinese say, that when you try to solve a problem, don't you have to find the root cause first? Otherwise, it's just like a cure on surface. It's quite superficial. What was the root cause for, China impose the restrictions on rare earth exports or raise the price of semiconductors? Professor
No, the root cause, as Professor Mahoney quite rightly said, that the Chinese wanted to target the United States, wanted to hit the Americans, and that Europe and Germany were collateral damage. It wasn't, let's say, intentional, but it didn't matter. The result was as it was, that export licenses and rare earth minerals were severely restricted, also the ones going to Europe and to Germany. Even if it wasn't intentional, the result was devastating and was made clear to the Germans that China had become an unreliable trading partner. And that, of course, then led them to adopt new policies, which were announced examination of the trading relationship with.
So you're saying Berlin has no other choice, or it can't, wrangle with Washington. So it turns its.
It also takes on Washington, but of course Washington is also a very strong player in the world, and German exports to the United States have actually gone down by over 7%, which is quite something. And the Germans don't like it. They also try to rectify, the relationship with the United States. And there's also the war, the geopolitical risk of Russia's war, which of course has also led to economic repercussions in terms of energy, pushing up the cost of energy enormously. And all that means the Germans feel squeezed in the middle, and they have to react. They cannot just allow other countries to squeeze them. For example, the profits, the sales of Porsche, that luxury brand of Porsche cars, they have plummeted by 98% last year. Imagine that, a famous company losing 98% of its sale worldwide. That shows there is a real crisis in German industry, particularly in the car industry. So the Germans have to do something, and that investigation of links, trading links with China is one reaction. But in principle, now I want to finish with that, in principle, I think Germany is in favor of free trade. They are in favor of close economic and trade relations with China. They do not want a trade war with China or any other country in the world, but they also feel they have to defend themselves and cannot just allow themselves to be squeezed by other big foreign countries.
All right, Professor Mahoney, do you share similar feelings for the German government?
Well, I would take a little bit of a different approach here. And there's so much to respond to there. I hope I don't forget it all. But the first is, I think Porsche is a poor indicator. One of the problems with Porsche is that they didn't do a fantastic job moving to the EV sector. They do have some EV products, but they're not very competitive in EV production. Whereas you can buy now a good EV, a Tesla, or even some of the Chinese brands that performance-wise can compete with, something like the 911, but at a cheaper price and with a green value. So I think that in that case, we have to be careful with Porsche as an indicator. But the question is, what was the trigger? And I would go back and say, for a long, long time, German industry was effectively subsidized by low-cost access to Russian energy. And that was something that drove the United States mad. And we saw quite a number of European industries, Airbus and others, that benefited not only from also having access to low-cost Russian energy, they also had access to substantial state subsidies. So that was something that was long in practice. The difference is the conflict in Ukraine cut Germany off from those energy supplies. And that's where we begin to see the precipitous decline in the German economy. And we can debate what was the trigger of that conflict. Certainly in Europe and certainly in Berlin, the consensus, and I don't agree with this consensus, seems to be largely that this was a provocation that Moscow bears complete responsibility for, and that Russia continues to have imperial designs on much of Europe. But, there's another interpretation, which is the United States for years had destabilized and tried to foster color revolutions in Ukraine and, expanded NATO to the point where this conflict occurred. In my own analysis, given my research that I did in Ukraine as field work, most of the Ukrainians I spoke with recognized absolutely that it was a proxy war between the United States and Russia over access to energy and how energy is paid for. I think that's the real trigger, which really sort of moves things in a different direction. Of course, there was the problem of the first presidency of Trump, which exposed Europe to the fact that they were dependent too much on the United States for security. And they did little to rectify that situation, despite the threats to NATO that Trump made in his first administration, and followed Biden into the conflict in Ukraine and committed themselves even more so ultimately than the U.S. did. And now Germany is still in this position of being dependent on NATO, which is still dependent on the United States, while trying to build its military capacity. And in order to do that, we've had allegations in Stern, one of the leading magazines in Germany, others that some of the German leadership has been a little dishonest in terms of how they presented drone threats coming over the border. So there has been this fear mongering to try to create or to change German public opinion to imagine that Germany and Europe are besieged not only by the United States or Russia, but also China. So these are the things that are developing. And honestly, I think this was a point that Jomi was trying to make a moment ago, in part, and I'll extend it here, which is it is reasonable for Germany to try to build its military capabilities so that it can actually establish an independent foreign policy. But in the meantime, it will have to do that while still hiding behind the skirts of NATO. At the same time, I think it's unfair. This is where I would disagree with Klaus. I think it's unfair to say that the trigger was the export controls, because this is something that's been building for some time. I think and here I'll give a very clear counter or example. When my son got stuck in the United States for COVID and he was going to middle school, he called me and he said,
Dad, today I learned why America went to war in World War I against Germany. I said, oh, well, why was that? And he said, well, because, the Germans sank Lusitania and sent the Zimmerman telegram to Mexico, trying to induce Mexico to attack the United States. I said, yes, son, but why did Germany do that? Why did they take these actions that virtually guarantee that the United States would enter the war, which would be the worst strategic outcome for Germany? And he goes, I don't know. I said, it's because the Germans had been buying materials from the U.S., war materials, but had paid for them in gold, whereas the French and the British had paid for them in credit. And at some point, the Americans figured out if the Allies lost the war, that it would tank the U.S. economy. So then they were going to go to war against Germany regardless. And German intelligence figured that out. And so they began the unrestricted surface warfare in the Atlantic and tried to induce Mexico. And then the United States used that as their excuse to go in. So I think a similar sort of thing is happening here, which is, the export controls did not actually bite the German economy, but it's being used to justify these policies, which have been developing since 2022. Going back to 2019, that was when the EU officially labeled China a partner, competitor, and systemic rival. And Germany has been a little out of step with Europe since then, but has increasingly moved to get in step. So I think it was clear to a lot of people that this was the likely outcome. And China knew that as well when they advanced the export controls, even though it didn't really have an impact on Europe.
Right. Professor Larres, can you respond in 1 minute? Because we need to move on with the rest of the part. Thank you.
I think we disagree quite strongly, or I disagree with you quite strongly about the whole complex of Russia's war against Ukraine. And of course, the Germans are fearful. If you've got a war not that far from your border and drones coming into your territory and the other territory, you don't know where these drones are from. But even, let's say, if the war between Russia and Ukraine had never started, then of course energy prices would still be lower in Germany. That is quite right. But the problems with Chinese trade would still be there. The Chinese have simply risen up in the value chain, and they are now competing actively with many products which the Germans used to make very successfully and sell very successfully. Now the Chinese are making these products themselves and sell them often up to 30% cheaper than the Germans can do. And that has a lot to do with subsidies in China, but it is clear that the competition, the trade and economic competition between Germany and China would have evolved without the Russian war. The Russian war has made things a lot worse, but it is not the root cause of having trade problems and economic problems and also political problems between China and Germany, which of course do not improve the climate. But I think in principle, economic relations and trade relations with Germany and China can be sorted out. And I think that is what the German government wants to do with that committee. It is not a committee just to punish China or to be anti-China. It's a committee which is supposed to look for solutions to rebalance trade once again, as it was in the past. Because at the moment, that trade has become very, very unbalanced. And the Germans, as I said, feel under siege. They want to defend and protect themselves.
Okay, thanks, Professor Larres. Dr. Zhou, you have 1 minute here to respond.
Yeah, I think that it's natural for every country to have a different consideration, but we cannot just spread the kind of concerns on every possible regions. We are not just say that China have a lot of issues, or you believe that there are some problems, but I think that we have to pay attention about the reactions of these policies on the possible stakeholders. Maybe they are not just trying to do something different with different partners. They want to stay here. So we have to build up some channels, between the government before we are going to make some decision directly to impact the market.
Thanks for the thought-provoking debate, and we now leave that part there. Coming up next, check out the possible economic ramifications of Germany's policy recalibration. Stay with us.
The best military commander is not he who fights 100 battles and wins every one of them. The best military strategy does not lead to the desiccation of the enemy's capital city. Decoding the Art of War will help you understand why there's no art in war and how Sun Tzu stayed undefeatable using the science of war, with fun stories and insightful breakdown of famous battles. Find Decoding the Art of War wherever you listen.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. We continue our chat on Germany's risky rebalance with China. Since the German government has taken this move, then what kinds of policy tools could Germany employ under this review? Some people familiar with the matter reveal that the measures the German side plans to take may include reducing or even eliminating guarantees for investment and exports to China, while also halting trade fairs and management training activities in China. Professor Larres, do you think it's sensible, or is it wise to do so?
I don't think that the German government wants to decouple from China.
Right.
The official policy for the last few years has been de-risking. De-risking meaning diversification, not putting all one's eggs into the China basket. So they're also looking around to trade more intensively with other countries such as India, Vietnam, Bangladesh. But they also know that these countries are no real substitute for the China market. So there is still no desire to decouple from China. And I think what the Merz government has announced should not be misunderstood in that way. Every country doesn't just focus on one major trading partner. Also, the car industry in particular is still a huge investor into China. They have built up local factories. They try to produce local products which are only sold in China, not, let's say, in Europe or in the rest of the world. So they really try to cater for the Chinese market. And that is their recipe. They want to basically compete with Chinese car makers, for example, BYD and others, in the Chinese market and prove the German products are better, that they can compete internally with China. So no one in Germany, including the Merz government, wants to give up on the Chinese market. They, would be very difficult to afford that, but there should be a level playing field. And at the moment, they believe for the last few years that there has been a clear imbalance in the trading relationship between China and Germany. For example, Germany now has a trade deficit in goods with China for the first time ever. And that seems to go into the wrong direction as far as the German government is concerned. And they want to rebalance that again. And I think in principle, there's nothing wrong with that. Trying to examine your trading relationship, trying to rebalance it. But it's not decoupling or ending the relationship with China. That would be highly unwise, and no one really wants to do that.
Do you see there's other measures like new export controls or tighter investment screening curbs on joint research coming then?
But that is only natural, and the Germans don't just do that with China. That is done with other countries as well. It is not targeted at China, though of course China, being a large trading partner, is highly affected by that. But any government in the world will pay attention to whether products which have to do with national security of that respective country, whether they get exported to a foreign country which may help the military of that country or undermine your own national security. I think the United States does it all the time, but other countries do it all the time as well. And I think China does it as well. And I think this is just a normal policy. And we are moving towards a world of greater suspicion, of greater protectionism. This seems to be the general climate, but it's not surprising that the EU Commission and then also the German government have adopted investment screening mechanisms. But that still doesn't mean that it goes in the way of decoupling. It has nothing to do with decoupling, by perhaps being a little more cautious, being a little bit more suspicious, but not decoupling from China.
Okay, Dr. Zhou, do you think Germany is doing what China has done, or is it following China's footsteps?
In my understanding, that what Chinese government is doing is a little bit different from Germany government right now. We are trying to think about these problems as global levels. I can understand that Germany is facing many challenges, including especially for the energy cost increases and also a lot of other factors becoming more expensive. So for the export to other countries, including China, maybe they are facing by the higher and higher cost of producing those products. So that would be one of the reasons, even in China, in different regions and provinces in China, some provinces told me that their electricity cost is a little bit higher, about 10 cents higher than the neighboring province, and they are not able to compete with them. So what we are going to do, from Chinese government, attitudes, we are trying to support these kind of practices by better and more foreseeable policies, and also trying to give them some support by the trade facilitation with our trading partners. So for Germany, I think that if you are going to rebalance the trade with another country, the best way is trying to promote the export instead of just limit the export. And in this regard, I think that we believe that, especially in many provinces and cities in China, they believe that the products of Germany is still be very high quality, and they really want to have the investment from Germany and establish the relations between our two countries. So we're not trying to stop that. We are going to support that by the better, listen what the companies really want from us, instead of just put everything in one basket, every issues, without any concerns about certain issues. We will not do everything else. So we are going to address the different requirement and also hear from the market and the pricing. I think that is the better way for us to make our wiser decisions in such a uncertain world.
Indeed, actually, when you take a move, you always have to consider or calculate the consequence or obviously benefits it can bring. Now, let's move on to maybe the impact of the German government's move. Professor Larres already mentioned the German chancellor has said the days of open markets and fair competition are gone, and his government must act to protect domestic industries. But whether the move can deliver the fruit it desires is another question. So, Professor Larres, what short and medium-term effects could this have on Germany's economy, which, has already seen 3 years of stagnation?
Yes, almost 4 years of stagnation. You're quite right, and that deeply worries the German government. It also worries the EU Commission, because Germany is clearly the economic locomotive of the entire European Union. So if Germany stalls, if Germany has economic problems, that actually affects every other country in the European Union. So it's very bad news. And unfortunately, we are increasingly in a new era of protectionism. And the era of free trade and of globalization is perhaps not over, but it is clearly stalling. It is not a free trade and globalization as only 10 years ago. And I think almost every country in the world, including China, including the United States, including the European Union, have become much more protectionist. And as far as the German government is concerned, when they look to China, what they see, and of course the Chinese see that very differently, but what the German government sees is that China heavily supports its industry with subsidies, that they strongly encourage production in China, which cannot be consumed by the domestic market. So there is a strong inclination by Chinese industry to export massively. And the Germans get concerned about solar panels, about batteries, about EV vehicles, and many other products. And it all started from the German point of view with China's 2025 China program, which was, of course, conceived in 2015. Ever since then, the Chinese have really tried to become global leaders in many of the products the Germans are good at as well. One can also say the Germans need to become better. Maybe they should produce better cars. They should produce better robots and better solar panels. And I think here some self-criticism is also justified, because consumers do not buy American or Chinese goods because they are worse. They're usually better or cheaper. So there's a reason why German products are losing out.
Yeah, that's the whole point of competition, right? And the comparative advantages. In talking about subsidies, like Professor Mahoney just mentioned, Germany in history had this wide subsidies for its industries, and now it also has this policy subsidizing like auto industry, the clean energy industry, right, Professor Mahoney?
Well, I think, again, what I was saying earlier is that subsidies in Europe, and although Germany was not the worst of the countries that to engage in that practice, there were effective subsidies at work. And certainly Germany, one could argue, benefited from being the center of the European economy and being able to largely dictate economic policy for other countries in the common market. That's, I think, a pretty well-established analysis. So Germany had advantages in the past. Those advantages are now diminished, and they feel competition now more sharply. But again, if we look at the new investment strategy that Germany is going to pursue, these will be effectively massive government supports or policies, or I don't know if it's fair to call them subsidies, to develop and advance German industries. So it's not simply that Germany is now sticking, I think, very faithfully to the principle of free market, but they're now moving much more in the direction of trying to directly invest and stimulate in their own economic development in ways that perhaps are somewhat similar to what we saw in China, but which were normatively more acceptable in a developing country than a developed one. There is this myth that persists overseas. It's one that China keeps pushing back against, that China is now a developed country and it should compete with developed countries on the same terms. And clearly, we know that in many respects, there's an effort to do this, and certainly to open up the Chinese economy more and more. But, we still have a very, very large population in China that is a low middle income. It's much more than the majority of the population. If anyone who's been out to rural areas and a great number of provinces, you'll see a country that is still a developing country that's still trying to realize the same sort of development levels that most parts of Germany already enjoy. So I think that we do see Germany moving in various ways to protectionist measures. Where this ends up, though, I'm not quite sure. We'll have to see who gets onto the committee. I think in Germany there are academics who are very vitriolic towards China, and although I don't think Germany wants to de-risk, they want to sustain as much as they can their economic trade with China. Nevertheless, there are a lot of people who have really tried to demonize anyone who's taken a soft position on China. And one of the things we haven't mentioned here is the fear in Berlin and other places of rising right-wing political movements, which, on the one hand, some of these governments feel like they have to get out ahead of them in terms of protectionism, but also they need to be concerned that maybe the right-wing parties in Germany have a softer position towards Russia, if not China. There's a whole lot of strange calculus. That said, I would draw another comparison here, which is before we saw the new prime minister elected in Japan, who once she was elected and then almost immediately met Trump and committed to the terms of the trade deal that her predecessor had negotiated, which was investing billions in the U.S. economy, while also reverting to Abenomics, which did not yield the national development goals that it sought before, but she will return to these despite the ruling party being in a weaker position to push forward the reforms that they weren't able to push forward before. And so basically what they'll be doing is piling on more debt while investing in U.S. economic development. Now, before all of that happened, in my conversations with Japanese diplomats, they were looking for some sort of way to build a closer economic relationship with China. Even the point of, could we have a trilateral trade deal with China, South Korea, and Japan? Where could that go? And could that provide an effective counterbalance to some of the threats being brought to bear by the United States? And ultimately, those efforts, I wouldn't say that they've failed, but for the moment, I don't think they're being pursued as aggressively as some people hoped, because Japan is caught in this middle position of still being dependent on the United States for security and as well as some economic benefits. So I think, we're waiting to see how that policy will mature in Japan, especially as Japan itself begins to take a more active approach in defense and how it engages in foreign policy, similar to the way Germany is now doing. And we'll have to see a year from now whether or not Germany will be taking positions that are more in line with decoupling or moving in a very responsible way, reflecting some sort of de-risking strategy.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Right, and also, out of curiosity, I also got a question for Professor Larres. If you got two students, one got everything done very neatly, like got study plans and got all A's or A+, and the other student who's, very loose with his lessons or classes. And do you think the better student or the good students should be the one to be picked on? Or what would you do then?
Absolutely, but the good student needs to play fair. If the good students achieved his good results by cheating or by undermining the other student by matters which had little to do with the actual exam, then I would say the good student really needs to be investigated. It's you shouldn't
Yes.
get away with that.
That's
Can I
true. Then
also
who
just-
could be the judge then? Isn't the WTO? If you think it's unfair, can't you just bring the unfair case to the WTO and for the judges to make some
Hey.
judgment?
Well, no, it's pretty easy between two governments. If one government, like the German government, feels that they are really being played by China and being exploited and treated unfairly, then what one does is one engages in diplomatic negotiations. One engages with that country and talks to that country. And when we recently had the German foreign minister's visit to China, and he could only get one appointment with a senior governmental official, and then he decided to cancel the whole trip because he didn't just want to talk to one person, though a very senior one. He wanted to have lots of meetings, and that wasn't allowed. So he simply stopped going to China. This was not good. That was not good on either side. The Chinese should, of course, have made more senior officials available to talk to the German foreign minister, and the German foreign minister should have used that opportunity to start better understanding, including in trade and economic policy. And I think both governments need to reflect here how better to engage with each other and have constructive talks and negotiations about the serious concerns they have. And that is often what happens, that I find that the concerns of the German government are not often being taken seriously. They are being dismissed as if they had a wrong impression. And I think this is not correct.
Dr. Zhou, your response here?
Yeah, it's natural for all the countries to deal with the problems in different ways. But as I said, that we already have the principles, that we all have made some commitments, as Yuan has just mentioned, like WTO is one of the platform. Maybe some countries are trying to violate its effectiveness, but I think that China and Germany, most of the German people are still believe that multinational the platform of WTO cannot be neglected or destroyed. So maybe to be more efficiently, we can deal with the problem bilaterally, but we still have to try to show our willingness and also trying to do something to improve that. So if you are looking at the cooperation between China and some developing countries, although our development stages are so different, maybe many countries are not having many advantages over Chinese producers, but we can still do businesses. I think it's natural for us to find a way if we want to do that. So that is my understanding about the relation. How can we deal with some of these not so agreed questions or some of these disputes? We can find some ways if we really want to do that.
But like Professor Larres just mentioned, the German side is complaining that Beijing is not willing to meet the foreign minister of Germany. That makes things probably even worse, Professor Mahoney. Is that so?
I think that's a little bit significantly an overstatement. We've seen German leaders, we've seen other European leaders come to Beijing. They've been warmly received. They've even met with the president on numerous occasions over the last several years. And so I think to say that China turned a cold shoulder to the German leadership is significantly an overstatement or mischaracterization of
I'm sorry. I have to interrupt. Okay. The foreign minister Wadefu was granted a meeting with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, and he wanted to talk to other senior officials as well. And no other meeting was facilitated. The only meeting on his calendar was with the foreign minister. No other meeting.
The way China works is that they don't often announce meetings before people actually show up because they've had the problem in the past of people grandstanding and then not coming. And so that's one of the ways that they handle diplomacy.
No, this is an unfair reply. I mean, really, Wadefu wanted to meet other people, not just Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and these people were not made available to him. And I think meetings shouldn't be cancelled. I don't agree with cancelling meetings, but I also don't agree with not making senior officials available.
Why does it need to be straightened up? Those meetings were not canceled. They were not arranged in the very beginning. So there was only one meeting between the foreign minister of Germany and the Chinese foreign minister. But maybe the reason is that he's responsible for foreign affairs, right? So probably others, it's not their responsibility to respond to or to meet this foreign minister of Germany at this moment. Actually, his counterpart here in China is a Chinese foreign minister instead of others, like a commerce minister or a defense minister.
I think it's normal that, maybe we cannot arrange the different kind of meetings just over the same times when we have some other meetings. I don't think that is kind of, abnormal actions by China because we have to find out what we can do really. The talk did not just start from the beginning. Nobody's showing its confidence or kind of good willings to have a talk. So maybe we need some mood, we need some conditions to discuss related issues. As for the official meeting, in my understanding, they want to still trying to establish the relation, especially from China to Germany. So in this regard, I don't think that is just what will happen after the ministers to meet with each other. Maybe the working group can start to do more even before that. If they cannot reach some consensus on certain issues, or they don't think that is meaningful for the ministers to meet. I mean, maybe it's not the time, but I don't think that has changed the attitudes from China's side to Germany.
All right. Then how do you expect Beijing to respond to Berlin's policy shift? Could China leverage its strengths in electric vehicle batteries, criminal minerals, or photovoltaic technology to remind Europe of its mutual dependence?
Well, I would say that as a fact, there are a lot of countries coming to China to make it stronger the connections on the supply chains, including the rare earths. So the problem is that do we have enough time to deal with so many changes? I think it's not only from China's side. We can speed up the process of guarantee the permits, but I don't think that is enough because all the requirements should be done by the enterprises. They have to know about the requirements and they have to fulfill this kind of requirements. So we should, by both sides, to trying to speed up this speed. If we are not able to provide the enterprises enough information or they are not able to understand the requirements, maybe they will slow down. But I don't think that China will be so hurried to deal with some of the relations with Germany and other EU countries. And we can find that the Spanish, emperor also visited China, and we had a very, very good talk about the possible relations between our two sides. So I mean, in my understanding that there are still so many possibilities, and we respect the relation with Germany, but everyone have to look at the fact and find out a better way to adapt it to the, some of this new situation about the uncertainty, which is very important impact for both of us.
Then how do you expect this to affect the Chinese economy, on the other side? Are we going to see, a lot of German companies maybe withdraw from the Chinese market or anything else? Or
in this regard, I would say that for any companies who want to have our sustainable development and also some very important development or innovation, they may to think about the opportunity of China. China is going to be the largest construction market in the world in the coming years. But I think that is, very unique because we are not just a super large market, but also our policies are very open. So we are not trying to restrict the investment from other countries. So I presume that in this regard, the German company, they would like to do more to have a sustainable development based on the market, not just based on some of these, policies from Germany, its own policies and also the decisions.
All right, to Professor Larres, could there be any unintended consequences for Germany then, such as, Chinese investment outflows, the relocation of Chinese-funded projects, or even accelerated outflow of German capital?
Absolutely. I don't think it's an ideal situation at all. It will damage Germany's economic performance. Both countries, as you said it in your introduction, are very close trading partners. They are partially the largest trading partner for each other. So it would affect both countries if there was a serious fallout in economic and trade terms. So I agree with what my colleagues here just said about engagement, and that one should try to overcome these really serious concerns. You want to have much more constructive negotiations and talks, and that applies to Germany and China and European Commission and China as well. And so I think both sides, in my view, should make a serious constructive effort to talk to each other and address these areas of concern and try to arrive at some compromise solution, because you do not want a decoupling. That's not productive for anyone.
Right.
So serious negotiations are really required, maybe behind closed doors, maybe without the world's press observing everything they say and everything they do, and arrive at really a constructive solution and address each other's concerns.
Indeed, and we don't want to see hostility increase here or emerge between the two countries. But last question to you all. Actually, this year marks the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and the European Union. So how may Germany's pivot reshape Sino-EU relations? Let's first begin with Professor Mahoney.
Again, I think we'll have to see how this committee works and whether or not we're going to see significant disruptions. I hope that we don't. I think one of the concerns is that China has been a little surprised that Europe has not been willing to negotiate on certain points, investment restrictions and concerns about EVs and other products. I think China felt like, okay, well, maybe we can work something out. Instead, they saw Europe moving in the direction of protectionism itself without that negotiation. So I think the general concern is that the trend right now is negative. Whether or not it can plateau and both sides can find a way to continue to deal with each other in responsible and mutually beneficial ways remains to be seen. I think we'll continue to muddle through for a while, but I don't think any of us have a crystal ball in terms of where we might be a year or 2 or 3 years from now.
All right, to Dr. Zhou, please.
So, it is a little bit surprising and disappointed for my personal view about the EU. They signed the agreement with the United States in such a kind of non-reciprocal way. So I think that maybe that is a business between EU and United States. But one of my concerns is that EU has given up its position about the multilateral system, the most favored nation, and trying to discriminate the different economies in the WTO framework. I think that is most dangerous and harmful for the global multilateral system. I think based on this kind of concerns, we have to be a little bit more cautious about the promises of EU. I think that is not what we really want to have. We still want to have a better cooperation based on the commitments that we have made in the past. And I think that's not only beneficial for both of us, but also for the developing countries and the rest of the world.
Right. And last but not least, Professor Larres, please.
Yes, as I said, constructive negotiations are necessary. And these negotiations between, for example, Germany and China, but also the European Commission and China, should be entered into as quickly as possible. And all distracting elements like Russia should be eliminated, should be tried to be downplayed and made less important. And I think in principle, China and Germany, China and Europe want to get on with each other. They want to have constructive trade and economic relations. And I'm quite optimistic that in the end, both countries will get there. But it will take some time. And here I agree with Professor Mahoney that we probably will be muddling through for some time. But hopefully, after some muddling through time, we will see an improvement of relations. But both sides need to work on that.
That's where we'll leave it for today. Many thanks to Professor Klaus Larres, the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Dr. Zhou Mi, the Deputy Director of the Institute of American and Oceania Study, Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, and Professor Joseph Mahoney, a Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University. Thank you for joining us and tuning in. Drop us a line anytime at radio@cgtn.com. We'd love to know what you think. I'm Tuyin. Catch us next week for more insights and stories at the Chat Lounge. Talk to you soon.
The strong wind was howling and whistling.
He was the first Chinese citizen to graduate from Yale University in the mid-19th century.
I was born on the 17th of November. She had prominent features. 3 of us were old enough to lend a helping hand.
He navigated between 2 vastly different cultures and moved further to realize his dream and promote understanding between the people of China and the United States.
Ye Mingxing was a native of Hanyang. I realized no danger. China is really awakening.
Come and join us in discovering the incredible journey of Yong Wang in his autobiography, My Life in China and America. Check out the Audible stories on radio.cgtn.com and all major podcast platforms. Just search for the podcast Books and Beyond and find My Life in China and America.